Hi, good morning, everyone. Yeah, it's still morning. We're going to be having a panel discussion here today. So according to the clock, we should have like 40 minutes, if I'm not mistaken. There's a time shift of 12 minutes, which is not too bad. Yeah, so for our panel here, we have three people. We just heard from Elspeth just now. And we have Monique and myself, Richard, here are going to be sharing with you about how building trust in open source and fintech can be interesting and challenging. Okay, before we begin everything, let's maybe begin with the introduction. Let's talk about who we are, why we're here, and maybe just a boring beginning topic, a fun fact about yourself. Okay?
Starting with me?
Sure.
You guys hear me? Is that on? Yeah. Okay, cool. Hello everybody. I'm Manik Surtani. I work at Block and been in open source for a pretty long time now, I guess from the very start of my career. Prior to Block, I was at Red Hat for many years, and prior to that, there's a small company called JBoss, which you may or may not know. A few people might know about it. But yes, so yeah, I've been open source for a long time. Block's been in open source for a long time. Block's probably better known as Square out here. You've probably heard of Square, ClearPay, and Tidal. So those are some of the brands that Block builds. Block's sort of the parent company above that. Always been very focused on open source from the very start of the company. Built ourselves an open source stack. Yeah, well, why am I here? Well, we're here to talk about open source in financial services companies like Block, which there's a lot to talk about there. It's going to be a lot of fun. And a boring fact about me.
Sure.
A boring fact about me. I don't know, where do I start? I've lived in 5 different cities across 3 different continents, and I still can't read Google Maps very well. I still keep getting lost in my own neighborhood. In fact, my wife has officially said that I'm not allowed to do directions anymore because I keep getting us lost.
Wait, but I saw you were a director.
Yeah, I know, right?
A director, okay.
With bad at directions, yes.
So we should be particularly glad that you're here today.
I made it, yes, I didn't get lost. Well, the other fun, boring fact is I've recently got diagnosed with adult ADHD, which means that my life is, a combination of extreme focus and, sorry, what was the question?
Very well. I think we have probably that version of you today.
There you go.
Elspeth.
So my name's Elspeth Minty. I'm a managing director at RBC Capital Markets, where I'm part of an architecture team that helps build central libraries and components for other developers to work. I'm also part of Finos, which is a FinTech open source foundation. Why am I here today? Well, it's State of OpenCon. Who wouldn't want to be here? Fantastic set of talks, fantastic event to be part of. Fun fact, boring fact. So I'm from a tiny village in the north of Scotland and ended up working in a number of different countries, currently living in Montreal, working related to open source. Someone else from the next village over from me is also part of open source, and that's Amanda Brock. We were at school together. No questions taken about how long ago that was.
Wow, the audience really love it, I can tell. Yeah, so hi everyone. My name is Richard Bian. I work for a company called Ant Group. If that name doesn't sound very familiar to you, it's a master company of Alipay, which is one of the largest payment network used on the planet, but primarily in China. Like why I'm here. First thing first, I attribute Ant Group Open Source Program Office in 2021. Have been working on that since then. Interesting enough, in my last life, which AKA before Ant Group, I was working at Square, which was a 2D version of Block. I totally missed out the 3D version of it. And interesting enough, I was not expecting Monique to be in the audience, so I was like, great, I can share a lot about Square, but no, not from my side. And
Still share about Square.
yeah, but I was working at, I was writing closed source software, so which embarrassed me a little bit. Yeah. Another thing is basically I've been pretty much like spending a lot of time outside of China and inside China. So I've been spending time in Singapore and Canada and the U.S. But I've been working in Hangzhou for like 4 years now. It has been a pretty long journey. Fun fact about myself is if you look at my name, so my real name is Sekang Bian. So the last name is like Spanish Bian, which is kind of makes me a good person. And my first name is like Sekong, so it spells like pretty much like scone. So it's I'm a good cookie, aka yeah, TLDR. Yeah, so like I mean we have a pretty good setup for the stage here today. I guess like one thing which we all share in common is we actually work at we all work at financial institutions, as well as I would say technology subsidiaries of it. It's just different forms, right? So for Ant Group we have a bank, and for Square we have Idle Bank, and for RBCs we're running a lot of technologies. And another, I would say, common layer we have is we are all work on policies. And so let's begin with a question. When people talk about, open source or, like financial institutions, the first term always comes into their mind is like policies, and it's a heavily regulated industry. At one point, you have this extreme like regulation around this industry. On the other side, you have this extreme, I would say, openness of open source. That seems to be a little bit, I would say, bipolar. I kind of get how you feel now. Yeah, so how do you perceive the policy? I mean, like when I say policy, it means like governance, compliance. Do you feel like it's more like the bare minimum of what we do as a day-to-day job, or it's more like, I would say, a very useful, I would say, metrics or a spectrum or a utility in which you can actually really work to use them to help with the institution? There are also people calling that necessary evil, right?
I mean, I think if you work in the financial industry, you expect a degree of regulation and oversight. It's a necessary part of working in this industry. I think there needs to be kind of a balance that we don't make it just too much for someone to be able to make an open source contribution. If you're making a one-line code fix, that is a very different prospect from we have some internal software that we want to open source. I think that the conversations there have to be very different, and the amount of governance and process that you go through has to be very different. But there is a minimum minimum level, and as with everything, you want to automate as much as possible. A lot of the concerns are about data or other internal information leaking out into the public. Those are things that you can scan for, you can automate that. And I think that is, making sure that we automate as much as possible is really important.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So the automation part of it actually resonates a lot with me. Similarly, again, I kind of agree that there's always going to be some amount of policy setting in terms of what sort of licenses, for example, that we are allowed to consume from, what sort of organizations we're allowed to consume from, like the Apache Foundation or the Linux Foundation and things like that. But also, again, in terms of giving back, like when you are open sourcing things, what's our default license? Right?
Yes.
And why do you think of, in what cases would you think of alternatives and why? And how do you help people navigate that? So that's all really important stuff that we have internally. It works really well. People actually appreciate that. I don't think it's ever seen as a bad thing. If anything, it's seen as a good thing because people are getting guidance. A lot of engineers are not lawyers. They don't, it's a challenging thing to try and understand which license do I pick and why do I pick that. Here's a CLA that I'm supposed to sign. Is anything bad in there? Is it going to cause me problems further down the road? So having things, again, having a toolkit, I think is really important. One of the things that we've done at Block with the Open Source Program Office is to build those toolkits. And not just the toolkits themselves, but also to host office hours and to have mentorship and things like that to help engineers navigate this landscape. But again, in my opinion, that's just the bare minimum, really. That we just provide people help with such policy things. There's more to it than that, of course. There's a lot more that I think an open source program office does beyond policy. Do you want to talk about that a bit, Richard?
Yeah, interesting enough, we sometimes use a term called accident-driven development. So it's like, that's actually how we built our OSPO back then, is because we end up having several open source related incidents, which people really kind of draw attention to. Oh, okay, you can actually get into trouble by not doing open source right. So I still remember for the first year that we end up having spent pretty much most of, like 1/3 of my time working on open source as a strategy initiative, which I'll probably share in my talk later after this. It's pretty much just on compliance and making sure that nothing goes wrong. Yeah, and speaking of which, while working on that, there has been this kind of paradigm talking about OSPO too, right? So it's like, do you feel like OSPO is actually this kind of enforcer, builder? Like many call that bare minimum, right? And I believe in RBC, I'm not sure if I have OSPO there, but...
We do, and like I said in my talk, I'm not part of the OSPO, but they are a group that I work very closely with, and it's the partnership. These groups can't work in isolation. They have to partner with the development community as well. And I think where they do, the OSPO can be a real driver for change.
Yeah. Definitely one thing which I personally experienced with is when you come to talk to the developers, it generates a negative feeling, especially on the first discussion. It's like, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to regulate me? Or are you trying to... So we end up having like really extreme and bipolar kind of behavior. There's this kind of developers who really abide to the rules. So they'll call you every time they're doing something and say, hey, Richard, can I do this? And I was like, I can't really tell you this way or that, right? Because it's not that kind of black and white. And then you have the other extreme of developers who are just like, hey, OSPO is really just trying to prevent us or slow us down. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. To your point about OSPOs trying to regulate people, that really should not be the framing at all. And it's really important to frame OSPOs as enablers, that we're here to help you work with open source, to create open source, to consume open source, to contribute back to open source, and to do it in a way that's safe, that's fast, that's low friction, that doesn't mean you have to read a whole bunch of legal documents and try and wrap your head around them. We've already done that, and we can give you the TLDR, we can give you the shortcuts, we can give you a framework you can now quickly take and run with. And that low friction piece, I think, is actually really important, especially when it comes to creating new open source software. Often there's a lot that you have to do up front. You've got to understand what license you want. You've got to build a CLA. You've got to build a code of conduct, a governance mechanism. And then, of course, that is the bare minimum. Then you've got to still do a whole bunch of stuff on top of that. You've got to make sure you're building, you want to make sure you're building a community. You're doing the right things. You're announcing it in the right places. And that's a lot of work there for every engineer to do. So we try and minimize that. You boil that down into reusable frameworks or components or toolkit, again, that people can use and run with. And what we're doing actually at Block is even one step further to make it even easier. It's something that you've probably seen in the Apache Foundation, where they have an incubator. You can launch new things with very little friction in an incubator and see if it sticks first. And if it really does start to gain traction, then you start to put in all the extra stuff, all the extra effort to grow it. And we're experimenting with that right now at Block as well, to be able to have an incubator to start and launch new things, see if it sticks, and if it does, then we start to put more effort behind it and take it further.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think that's probably a question we can take offline a little bit after this. It's about incubation. In fact, recently we just converted our OSPO team into a different name. It's kind of called Open Source Growth Team now. And then we're kind of rebranding our, I would say, the governance body from a community into an incubator, kind of similar to a hybrid of CNCF and Apache.
I love the framing there, an open source growth team. That's the words matter. Yeah.
The words really matters. Yeah, speaking of which, when we talk about growth, right, so essentially it's all boiling down to how to motivate the engineers and open source teams to work on open source. It's very interesting that, Elspeth got a question from the audience just now, is RBC contributing to open source, right? Because I can imagine that all of us will be the open source users for sure, right? All the institutions are. But if you're going to be an open source participant, is basically the next question everyone asks.
And I think the finance industry is not the one that immediately springs to mind on where there is open source. We are regulated, and that's seen as a barrier to entry, I think, by a lot of people. And even within our own organizations, that you talk to people and they're surprised that we are allowed to do that.
Yeah, well, I mean, tell us more about it, because, I mean, for people like us, we're the enablers, right? There's this kind of de facto standard, but there's also the glorious future that we want to drive for. How do you see that? And
I mean, I think the glorious future. I think it should. This type of contribution should be a contribution approach should be pretty much business as usual. If we are using open source software, we should be contributing to it, and we should be working either helping finance support for open source maintainers or doing contributions ourselves. The finance industry is a very competitive industry. We all compete against each other, but there is a fairly large degree of software that is common across the whole organization, the whole industry. The regulatory tech that I talked about, everyone has to do the same thing. And it's areas like that, and it's areas where there are interchanges between companies, like some of the settlement work that's going on to bring settlements to T+1. All the work that's going on there involves communication between companies, and there's a real opportunity for using common data models to drive those communications and standardize there, and that's as much open source, I think, as the software itself.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. That's a really interesting point. Open source is not just software; it's open standards as well, which I think is critical, especially in finance.
Yeah, definitely.
so, yeah, I mean, like, we can definitely expand a little bit more on that. So, like, Monique, I know that when I left Square, we don't have a OSPO, and now we have one, which is great to hear. So how do we motivate engineers? I mean, the engineers at Square, as far as I know, are pretty open and active already. But I mean, what are some of the things that we do?
Yeah, that's great. That's thank you for the question. That's a good one. So we've always been, as I said, very, very deeply involved in open source. The company was built on open source underpinnings from our entire tech stack, and we've always had lots of really great involvement with the open source community. But that's always been at a grassroots level. It's been happening, for example, deeply in the Android community. In fact, like pretty popular Android libraries like OKHTTP and OKIO and Retrofit. Some of them are now de facto standards. Some of them are now included in the Android SDK. So, and that all came from us. We built that stuff. So, we have a lot of impact there. But it's not just there. Also in things like networking stacks and lots of cloud infrastructure, lots of database infrastructure that we built and open sourced, and that's sort of had its place, taken its place in the world and the community. But that's always happened in isolation in specific areas. So spinning up an OSPO really has been, let's actually now look at this strategically across the company and let's amplify it. When you said open source growth, that basically is what our OSPO is. It's not just a regulations body or a standards or a policy setting body. Of course, we do that too. That's a part of our remit. But a big part of it also is growth of open source and adoption, not just internally, but externally as well, both sides. How do we build communities? How do we make sure we're working well with existing communities? And then that goes to what you were just asking me about around incentives. Yeah, incentives. How do you then motivate people to do that? And it's been really interesting. So we've had a few people that we've hired very early on who are already big names in the open source community, and they've been a big part of Block from the beginning. But that's still a very tiny slice of our overall engineering population. I mean, just less than 10%, maybe.
Less than 10%.
So it's a small group compared to overall. Most of our engineers, excellent engineers, but they come from more traditional software backgrounds. They're not used to open source. They're nervous about open source. They're okay with consuming. They're more nervous about contributing back. They're more nervous about upstreaming their fixes and patches, more nervous about open sourcing their projects themselves. So, I mean, setting up internal mentorship groups is what we've been doing, like pairing them with the more experienced open source engineers to learn from them, learn techniques, learn how to deal with community, learn how to, not be afraid of getting shouted at on the internet because someone didn't like a patch that you submitted or something, which happens unfortunately. But also learn how to build community, learn how to promote your work, learn how to promote your project. And that's just one aspect of it. That's from engineers. There's also a lot of education around engineering managers and leadership. How do you create the space and the time for engineers to work on open source? How do you make sure it's relevant to their work, to their companies, to their roadmaps? And then, of course, it doesn't just stop at that. It's also a lot of education with the business as well to make sure, again, that our product teams and our business teams understand the value of open source, understand how much we gain from it, and make space for it and budget for it. It's working with our legal teams and our compliance teams, again, to make space, to remove friction, to let people move fast while still moving safely. And that's also really important. And then, of course, why do we do it? Why is open source important? It goes back to that question as well.
Right.
A big part of that is engineering culture. It's being able to hire, which means, again, if you want to realize some of those goals, you want to work closely with our HR teams and our people team to make sure, again, they understand open source. And they're baking that into our hiring practices, into our promotion practices, into our engineering ladder. So that again, ties back to the very front of incentives again.
Right, so it's
Individuals.
yeah, all the dots are connected.
So yes, it's a big bag of stuff, but it's all very clearly connected in one loop. So yeah, if that makes any sense.
Totally.
And how do people get started as well? You have the conversation, like you were saying, about it can be really scary doing the first contributions, and like where do you start? You're not. I think it'd be highly unlikely that someone's first contribution is going to be a major change. That people need a way to engage with open source that helps them start to feel comfortable with it. And OSPOs, I think, play a really important role in that.
Yes, well, in the sense that OSPO helps create the structure and the frameworks, but even more than that, it's actually then running those programs, like that mentorship program that I mentioned, but taking that even a step further. Like we've got an upcoming Hack Week, for example, coming up in the company soon. One of the tracks in the Hack Week is an open source track where we will pair you with an experienced open source maintainer or an experienced open source developer, and you get to go and work on something open source. And this is a gentle way to get someone used to doing something they're not otherwise used to doing, whether it's a major contribution back to an existing project or preparing one of your projects for open sourcing or helping expand the community that you've already, on a project you've already open sourced, things like that.
Yeah, definitely.
So it's kind of interesting because I remember basically like at Square we have Jack Walton and Jesse Wilson. I know Jack Walton has left the company, came back. We never had any troubles hiring Android engineers, right? All the Android engineers they want to come to work for Square. And for Ant Group has a very strong front-end team. So at one time there was no effort made to hire front-end engineers. All the front-end engineers they want to work at Alibaba, they want to work at Ant Group. It becomes a very natural way of doing it. But then over time we begin seeing this kind of trend of. So first thing first, I would say when we talk about growth and incentives, it has something to do with projects as well as individual contributors, right? So it's like two different problems. Typically, the company will have a lot of incentives working on projects, right? So they kind of hire the projects. We're doing a lot of the support from like developer experiences to like growth, go-to-market strategies and everything. And essentially, OSPO is actually serving the projects. That's like one way how we actually begin building our reputation and trust. Kind of back to our square one, right? It's like how we're actually building trust and people believe in open source. That's how we gain trust at the first place. But then we'll actually move on to the base 2, as we kind of like call the baseball game. It begins getting more difficult because of the, you mentioned about 10% of the Square engineers was kind of open source engineers, right? Kind of.
Well, from an open source background, yes.
Yeah, from open source background. For Ant Group, we have like 12,000 engineers. And now we have open source group has like 400 people in it, so it's about 2%. So it's a different challenge. It's I would say it's a much harder challenge because like for instance, while you Slack, so there was one time that was like using Slack is not acquired skill. People know how to use Slack. But after I've been working with engineers in Ant Group, one thing I learned is like people doesn't know how to use Slack. They don't know how to do async communications. It's acquired skill. So we began actually building, I would say, a talent program internally by kind of putting essentially like engineers into different, I would say, tiers and stages. And we have different programs helping them. So for instance, like last year, we have this kind of hack week, kind of very similar to it, or like hackathons internally, which is pretty much addressing the engineers who are not participating in open source. So that's pretty much the first part of the funnel to attract more people, increasing 2% to maybe something like 3, 4, 5 as time goes. And for the current open source developers who are not proficient, we are building like workshops and educating programs, SOPs, and we're inviting external speakers and like people are working in open source to really help them. All of that over the years it kind of came in different stages. For instance, like the workshops, we're doing that very heavily. It's like 1 month, like open issues. And we're actually giving them like PS5 for winning the competition or something like that.
You're talking about incentives. That's incentives.
Yeah, talking about incentives, yes.
Gaming consoles.
Whatever works. Like, not that console. It's a real game console, yeah. And a lot of that actually like begins kind of adding up to our, I would say, technical, as we call the TLs, right, the technical leaders. And then we're trying to grow the technical leaders to be the community leaders by making more of our projects to be community projects. So last year we sent like 3 projects to Apache. In fact, Ant Group didn't have any Apache project before last year, surprisingly. And now we have 3 Synset projects, 1 Alpha AI and data project, and we just signed up with Finos last year. So a lot of those are essentially trying to help the technical leaders to grow into community leadership so that they're not only well known within the company that, hey, this is open source guru, rather, like we would like them to be recognized as a community that is, they're really the community leaders.
So I'm kind of curious, and I'm going to ask a question here. You were both talking about the percentages of the developers who are actually contributing to open source, and they're fairly low percentages, and it's the same, I think, at RBC as well. What do you think is the reason why so few people can get involved?
So I think that it's just like most people come from traditional software backgrounds, and that muscle hasn't really been exercised. That you're working with a community and that you're working with in the open. It can be nerve-wracking if you're not used to that. So,
Yeah.
Sure.
Also, the first time when I was actually working, Ant Group was actually my first job in China. When I came back to China, one of the first questions I got is like, hey, there's a term called 业务, which is Mandarin. It directly translates into business. So I was like, what does 业务 or business mean, right? And then I figured out it's basically the business and engineering. I was like, that sounds very weird. Because engineering is part of the business, right? But that's pretty much one of the challenges in which there has been a traditional, I would say, handicapped perspective towards engineering. It's like engineering is serving the business part, not the other way around. Of course, there has been a time in which the company has been very technical driven. We're actually trying to bring it back to that stage with our new CTO. So to answer Elspeth's question, I would say that it's difficult by nature. But with a good guidance in terms of like trying to tell a reasonably good business narrative about how open source is actually not orthogonal with the business, but rather is part of it, will help. So that's basically one of my observations.
Yeah, that's all really interesting. Do you want to touch on inner source?
Yes, let's talk about
that briefly.
Yeah,
So,
interesting enough, I think Elspeth actually mentioned about inner source, and I know Monique, you've been working on that a lot. Maybe you want to spend 2 minutes, let people know about what the inner source is, and then we can talk
I'll
about
give
it.
an overview as to what it is, but I'd love to hear about how, again, you guys are implementing it and what you've seen work and not work. So inner source essentially is using a lot of open source practices on a code base that is not open source. The idea being that if you've got a code base that's owned by team A, traditionally, only Team A can work on that code base. If anyone else wants changes to it, they have to send in a feature request, and then that team may someday put it on their roadmap and may someday release it in their work and things like that. Whereas InnerSource really sort of treats that repository of code as though it was an open source repo. The only difference being that not everyone in the world has access to it, but everyone in the company does, which means anyone in the company can send in a pull request saying, hey, look, I rely on that service of yours. I've just noticed a bug. I'm going to send you a fix. So what it does is it empowers people rather than saying, the thing I depend on is broken. I need to wait for that team to fix it. Nope, I'm going to fix it myself. There you go. There's the fix. And I think that's a really, really powerful model where you start to bring in some of the community aspects of open source, some of the collaborative aspects of open source, some of the aspects of joint and shared ownership, and you start to apply that on code bases that for some reason or the other you may not be able to actually open source. And there are many good reasons why some things you won't open source, either because it is too close to the business, it might be something that's too close to the business model that you might not want to open source, or it just might not be valuable in the open source space. Like, for example, we've got a bunch of things which is basically glue code that connects a bunch of other systems in a particular way that only works for us. Yeah, sure, we could open source it. No one else is going to see any value in it. And that's just polluting the open source space. So let's not open source that, but we want that to be inner source so others can contribute to it and help maintain it. So that's my spiel on what inner source is. I'd love to hear how it's working for you guys and how you use, whether you do use it.
I think I'm a huge proponent of inner source. It's basically what I do for a living. And it's a way to kind of get the collaborative ethos into an organization. But I always find that very counterintuitively, it's almost harder to get people to engage in inner source than it is to engage in open source. I think it's something that requires a consistent messaging, a consistent pushing to make sure that the programs continue and that people really engage with it. It's something as well that there is a huge benefit to companies for taking this approach. There is a lot of wheel reinvention that goes on within the companies and just across different teams, and being able to centralize this is very powerful because you get you just get the multiplications of people involved and eyes on code, and all the stuff that we talk about as the benefits of open source, you get through inner source as well. So I think it's hugely important, but it's really difficult to really do it well.
Yeah, in fact, I mean, like at Ant Group, we did inner source at one time with a full roller coaster. Unfortunately, it's not kind of going up first and going down, not the other way around. But we actually learned quite some lessons from it. First thing first, I fully agree with Elspeth, is inner source is much harder to motivate. To some extent that if you do have a monorepo already, I think at Square, I remember we do have monorepo in which people can contribute code, but there's a policy and I would say SOP to be followed, but people can see the code. But it's a luxury. In many other, I would say, financial institutions, it's kind of hard to do it. On the other hand, we do see open inner source actually increases, I would say, the engineering excellence and engineering agility to some extent. But toward the end of the day, it really has something to do with who the sponsors are. And we used to think inner source is a staging environment. But then I kind of changed my mind. If you want to do open source, you do open source. We can combine. I do work with the Inner Source Commons friends a lot, and we're essentially trying to combine their ideas and practices into our open source SOPs, so that can get the benefit from both sides. Yeah.
Yes, for sure. I don't think it should be seen as a staging environment per se, but it still is a good environment where people can start to get more comfortable in that level of extreme collaboration, especially in larger companies where, Block's got about 5,000 engineers, but places like Google or even Ant with many more engineers, having your code base accessible by all of them is it's just one way to sort of get past the anxieties of having your code be accessible by anyone in the world.
Wow.
And a great way for developers to really develop their skills by getting feedback in what is a much safer environment than going out into open source,
Right.
which can be kind of scary.
Yeah. So we have about like 4 minutes left. So I think one of the last questions in which we're talking about is we're talking about open source here, but also talking about open standard. Interesting enough, I mean, for fintech, it's one of the areas in which not only open source by itself is challenged. We also have like a lot of issues. For instance, I mean like ACH, which is a de facto standard for settlement in many places of the world, is now used in China, right? And we're facing like very different, I would say, open challenges. How can we collaborate better? I know Elspeth mentioned about Finos, right? Finos maybe is one of the vehicles in which we can use, but what else, right? I mean, how can we really collaborate better on the fintech aspect, which seems to be really bipolarized and hybrided in that sense?
I mean, I think we do need organizations like Finos because we're not going to talk to each other otherwise. It is
Maybe Open UK.
Yeah,
It's a good place to be at.
We need some form of place where we can all come together that sets rules for how we talk to each other and gives us a safe space. Having companies talk about these things is important, and it's not really going to happen if it's one-to-one. We need to have these gatherings where we can come together and just talk about things.
Yeah, well, strongly agree. Not much to add there. Yes, I think there's a lot of scope for open standards in finance companies. I mean, open banking is one, but that's just one aspect. I think there are many, many more aspects, and I think we should be talking more about such things, absolutely.
Yeah, I kind of share that particular aspect because I think like my hunch feeling is Ant Group does have a lot of open source projects. It kind of at this moment, we do have a discoverability problem. So we're beginning doing some of the internationalization efforts, go-to-market initiatives. But at the same time, we begin realizing that our primary audiences, right? Because a lot of technologies, in which I have part of that in my presentations upcoming, fintech actually is a pretty difficult domain. You have to build like some of the very concrete technologies in order to facilitate those kind of scalability, accuracy, and compliance requirements. There has not been much vehicles for us to actually collaborate together. So for like Finos is definitely a good vehicle, and I'm very glad to thanks so much to OpenUK for having this like finance openness track, which was really eye-opening for me, that we can actually work and talk together. So maybe we'll end up this panel with like just a very quick 30 seconds of call to actions for the audience, or just like your wishes for the future, one way or the other.
I guess collaborate, work with each other, go figure out who your OSPOs are, talk to them, tell them what you need. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Yeah, that's a very good call to action, but I'll add to that as well, but also talk to us. Talk to our OSPOs, talk to our, we're doing a lot of stuff in open source ourselves. Come engage with us. Open source is nothing without a community. Help us be a part of that community.
Right, so if you're financial institutions, you can benefit from building OSPO. If you're a fintech company, by all means, building OSPO will be pretty beneficial. We're still trying to essentially working together with some of the, I would say, communities together, like CNCF and everyone else, trying to see if we can build an OSPO network. So our OSPOs and, for our liaisons, open source liaisons can be well connected and really help our companies, developers. With that, I think that concludes our panel today.
Do you have any questions from the audience, though? Yeah. There's one over there.
Please.
Hello, thank you for the panel. Really enjoyed it. I was curious about, from the perspective of a financial institution, I think the obvious, the benefits of like consuming open source software, the incentive is clear, but what incentive is there from the point of view of the institution to invest money into something that helps everyone? Where's the incentive for them?
We're helping our competitors. Yeah, it is a discussion that happens. I think it's a case of making the value proposition that we get more as an institution for doing that than we lose by doing it. There's very clear benefits to us on the development side that it accelerates our development. The code is generally very good quality. It helps with our hiring. You start adding all those up, and it becomes a very strong value proposition. And when you add on the work that's going on, within the financial institutions, between financial institutions, on open standards and the regulatory standardization, there's business value there. It saves it lowers the cost of doing business, and it also makes staff more flexible between different projects and between different companies as well. You can hire people who understand how to do something, and when you start adding all that up as a whole, there's a strong business value.
So yeah, it's just like measuring ROI, right? Like, is it worth it? And not just financial institutions, but companies in general have already come to terms with the fact that the ROI is worth it the lower down the stack you go. So, for example, people use Linux, they contribute to the Linux kernel, they use MySQL, et cetera, et cetera. That's not seen as a problem. So, okay, then now you raise that further up the stack. Why is it now seen as a problem then if you're doing it for an ACH service or a service that connects to Visa or a service that connects to open banking? These are all commodity things at that level as well. It's just commodity at a slightly higher level. So it's just getting people used to the mentality that it's exactly the same as, working on an open source Linux kernel. It's not going to impact your business negatively there. Same thing, slightly higher up.
Yeah, likewise.
Yeah, I'm gonna stop us here because I'm gonna keep us on and say, as we said before, what was the call to action? Find them afterwards. We have one more 15-minute session and then we have lunch. So I'm not gonna hold us all between there, but thank you to the three of you for the discussion.